Hi class, in this recording we're going to start talking about the female reproductive system. And just to brace yourselves before we dive in, it's complicated. It's way more complicated than the male reproductive system. So for the female reproductive system, I ended up breaking it up into 3 lecture presentations as opposed to the male reproductive system, which was just 1 lecture presentation. So let's dive into it. As we look at our female reproductive system, I guess I stole my thunder there. It's really complex. And the reason it's really complex is because it does a lot more. When we think of the male reproductive system, it's just all about gamete delivery. The male reproductive system is not very concerned about the quality of the gametes. It takes more of a quantity over quality approach. And the female reproductive system is on the other end of the spectrum. It takes a quality approach to the production of gametes. So that secondary oocyte, that ovum that's ovulated, is going to have a lot invested into that single cell. And in addition to producing and delivering those gametes, it also needs to receive gametes from the male system. It also needs to, when the gamete is fertilized into a zygote, and then eventually to a blastocyst that implants, we need to have nutrition provided for it within the uterus so that we can go from an embryo to a fetus to a baby. And then the woman needs to be able to get the baby out of her body. She needs to be able to give birth. And then after giving birth, she needs to be able to breastfeed the child. She needs to nourish the infant. Wow, she's way more invested in this reproductive process than the males are. When it comes to males, unless you're talking about pipefish or seahorses, generally speaking, the female reproductive system is going to be way more complex than males. As we look at this female system, we also need to mention that cyclic. There's a monthly cycle, and there are going to be a lot of hormones associated with that monthly cycle that give it a lot of complexity. As we look at the genitalia of the female reproductive system, we can break it up into 2 categories. We have internal and external. External genitalia are the things you can see from the outside. And I will admit, it's a pet peeve of mine and this was a lot of locker room talk back from when I coached wrestling. I would hear teenage boys say, "Oh, I saw her vagina." And to answer that question, no, you didn't see her vagina. You saw her vulva. And that vulva, V-U-L-V-A, is a collective term for a term that refers to the collective external genitalia, where we have the clitoris as a highly sensitive organ. Then we have the labia minora that wraps around the vestibule. And then we have the labia majora that are lateral to the labia minora. When we look at the internal genitalia is going to begin with the vaginal canal. That will then lead, oh my goodness, I am so sorry. That was the urethra. And you think I teach A&P. It's going to begin with the vaginal canal. There we go. That's the vaginal canal, which leads up to the uterus. And as we look at the uterus, that uterus is going to be right here. It's also going to include the uterine tubes, formerly known as the fallopian tubes. And it's also going to include the female gonad, the ovary. Now, as we look at all of these organs are going to be visibly noticed within the perineum region. So that perineum region typically is going to go from here down to here to the anus. To look at a mid-sagittal slice. Now, if we were to look at a spread eagle view, where we didn't, instead of a mid-sagittal slice, that spread eagle view would be more of a triangle, more of a diamond as opposed to a triangle. As we look at the primary sex organ for the female, that is the ovary, that is what produces the female gamete. Just to review, primary sex organs are what make the gamete, and then we have secondary sex organs. Those are what the individual uses to help deliver and or fertilize and nourish the gamete. As we look at that female primary organ, sex organ, the ovary, we find that the ovary is going to be one of 2. There's 2 ovaries, and it's going to produce eggs, also known as ova, and a wide variety of sex hormones. Those sex hormones include estrogen and progesterone as the 2 most significant sex hormones being produced by the ovaries. But there are some that are important to a smaller degree, like inhibin, for example. The ovaries are going to be almond-shaped, but they're about the size of a walnut. And in my opinion, they're more walnut-shaped in humans. but your text uses the almond analogy. When I've done cadaver dissections, they tend to be a little bit bumpier, like an English walnut. And we find the ovaries on the posterior of the pelvic wall, which is to say that they are going to be nestled against the posterior of the pelvic cavity. The ovaries are going to be wiped in a white castle known as the tunica albuginea. The root word here is albu, which stands for white. Think of albino. Tunic refers to a coat or wrapping around. So this is going to be white and wrap around the outside of the ovary, this tunic. So we have tunica albuginea of the ovary, just like we have one for the testes. And then within the outer edge of the ovary, we have a bunch of germ cells. And these germ cells are what give rise to the gametes. Within the middle of the ovary, we have a region that's highly vascularized called the medulla. It's going to have a lot of arteries and veins. And then we find that each egg, or each ovum, to use the technical term, each ovum is going to have its own little incubator. And we call these little incubators follicles. And the follicle is going to be filled with fluid. And eventually that fluid can rupture out of the follicle. That process of bursting or rupturing is known as ovulation, when that ovum is released. And you can see that happening down here, where we have the fluid gushing out of the follicle and that oocyte is being ovulated. As we look at the uterine tubes, just to review, those used to be referred to as the fallopian tubes, but now they're being renamed based on the structure as opposed to the name of the individual who discovered them. So they connect to the uterus, so we call them uterine tubes. Also known as the egg tube. Ovi means egg, duct means tube. So if somebody says oviduct, they're referring to the fallopian tubes or uterine tubes. And these are going to be about 10 centimeters long and travel from the ovary to the uterus. And our uterine tube is broken up into three areas. We have the infundibulum, which is wide like a funnel and has a bunch of little fingers or fimbriae attached to it. And then we have the middle half, which is going to be the ampulla, the narrowing of the funnel, and then the isthmus at the end, the last 25% approximately, where things really narrow, the diameter narrows, and the rate of flow increases. The uterine tube is highly muscularized, and it's going, those muscles allow for peristaltic movements, and it also has a bunch of cilia within them as well. And those cilia are going to push the egg towards the main cavity of the uterus. In addition to the peristaltic movements pushing the egg towards the main body of the uterus. As we look at the uterine tubes, that uterine tube is broken up into four primary structures. The fimbriae, or fingers, is what that word literally means, are going to flare outward and grab that little oocyte. So I'm circling an oocyte right there. The fimbriae are going to grab the oocyte and kind of yank it into the funnel. We refer to the funnel as the infundibulum. And that infundibulum will start to narrow until we get to the ampulla, and that ampulla is going to make up approximately 50%-ish the entire length of the uterine tube. And then right away at the very end, we have the isthmus. And that narrower portion down here will cause the egg to accelerate. And one of the reasons the egg accelerates is because we have a continual rate of fluid flow. So because we have a wide channel over here, the fluid can flow slowly and still have the same volume per second being moved. But over here, where it gets narrower in the isthmus, to have the same volume per second moving, we have to have a fluid flow rate that's much higher. The fluid flow velocity needs to increase. As we look at the uterus itself, our uterus is going to be just a big muscular sac. It's just a big chamber made of muscle. And the neck of the uterus is going to extend into the vagina and open into the vaginal canal. As we look at the uterus, it usually is going to tilt forward or anteriorly and rest over the top of the urinary bladder. Let me go back a couple slides here to give you a good view of that. Oh, too far. There we go. So we can see that uterus right here, typically sitting directly superior to the urinary bladder. And one of the things that happens as a woman becomes pregnant is that uterus will push down onto the urinary bladder and make it so that the woman needs to urinate more frequently. As we look at the shape of the uterus, it's generally going to be pear-shaped. And we are going to have the base of the pear on top, and then we're going to have the apex or the pointy end of the pear on the bottom. We refer to this big broad shape on top that's superior to the uterine tube's axis point as the fundus. And then we're going to have the main body of the uterus. Let's use blue for the body. So the main body of the uterus is going to begin at the fundus where the uterine tubes attach to the uterus, and then go all the way down to where the uterus extends into the vaginal canal. And then I'll use red down here. This portion that, red, there we go. This portion down here that extends into the vaginal canal is known as the cervix, and it's going to be inferiorly located. And then when we think of structure and function, you could think of the uterus as being a giant incubator. It's going to receive that fertilized egg, the zygote. By the time it gets down to here, it's typically going to be a blastocyst, and that blastocyst will implant, grow, and develop and go from an embryo to a fetus to a baby, and then there's birth, and the child is born. As we look at the inside of the uterus, its lumen is roughly triangular shape. And when we think of lumen, just to review, lumen is a generic term that refers to the hollow space in a hollow organ. And as we look at the lumen, it's going to start typically at the uterine tube entrance point and then extend down towards, not all the way to, but towards the internal os. And this internal os is the internal opening of the uterus. We also have another opening down here, the external os. And in between the internal and external os, we have a cervical canal. Now, a common misconception a lot of people have is that the uterus is a hollow cavity, and that's not true. Kind of like the vagina is not a hollow canal, but a lot of young men have the misconception the vagina is this empty space within the woman's anatomy. That's not true. The vagina is a potential space. It's an area that can make room for a penis during sexual intercourse. And the uterus is a spot that can make room for a child when the woman is impregnated. Now, as we look at the cervical glands, we have lots of tiny little microscopic glands within the inner lining of the uterus. And they are going to be uterine glands that help feed the child, the implanted embryo. We're also going to have cervical glands, and I got ahead of myself there when I shouldn't be talking about uterine glands. Let's talk cervical glands. Cervical glands are going to be down here, and they are going to also line the cervical canal, and they are going to release a lot of mucus. And this mucus is going to make it difficult for microorganisms to travel up into the woman's reproductive tract. It keeps the microbes from the vagina, or from within the vagina, from getting into the woman's reproductive tract. Now, as we look at the wall of the uterus, it can be broken up into 3 layers primarily. We have the perimetrium, myometrium, and endometrium. As we look at perimetrium, peri means outer perimeter. When we think metri is a root word that means uterus. So the perimetrium is the external serosa layer of the uterus. Then we have the myometrium, myo meaning muscle, and then metri meaning uterus. So the muscular uterus, so the uterine muscle is the myometrium, and it's going to have a lot of smooth muscle within it, primarily. Very small amounts of skeletal muscle are present, but overwhelmingly it's going to be made of smooth muscle tissue. And that smooth muscle is going to give the woman labor contractions. It's going to help with the expelling of the child, the fetus, during the birthing process. And it's also going to be responsible for those wonderful uterine cramps. Oops. There we go. So as we look at that third and innermost layer, the endometrium, Metrium is the inside of the uterus. Endo meaning in, metri meaning uterus. And it's a mucosal layer. And this is going to be made up of a columnar epithelium with lots of compound glands. And these compound tubular glands are going to be referred to as uterine glands or endometrial glands, and they secrete something known as uterine milk. So that during an implantation process, before a placenta can form, that growing embryo has access to nutrition while the embryo is developing a placenta for nutrient exchange. Within the endometrium, we're also going to have a lot of white blood cells, leukocytes, and we can take that endometrium and break it up into two layers. We have a functional and basal layer. The functional layer is going to be shed. This is what's going to cause the mensing. So once a month, approximately during a menstrual period, when there's mensing or menstrual flow, that's this functional layer sloughing off and exiting the uterus. There's a deeper basal layer, and this deeper basal layer is going to stay behind and then regenerate the functional layer once per menstrual cycle. Now, during this pregnancy process, the endometrium is where that embryo will always attach. It's the point of attachment, hopefully, unless there's something weird like an ectopic pregnancy going on. And then the inner part of the embryo will form the placenta, which is then going to use the developing fetus, or is used by the developing fetus for nutrient exchange with mom's bloodstream. So as we move on to the vagina, here is a photomicrograph of a vaginal canal. And as we look at the vagina, it's typically to be 8 to 10 centimeters of length, 8 being the shorter end, 10 being the longer end of the spectrum. And the vagina is going to allow for menstrual fluid to escape with the monthly cycle. It's also going to be a potential space for the penis to be inserted and deposit semen during vaginal intercourse. And then finally, the vagina or birth canal is a way for baby to get out of mom during the birthing process. And as we look at the vagina, it has some layers to it. We have an outer layer of connective tissue referred to as adventitia. And then we have two layers of muscle, an inner and outer muscularia. Excuse me, I misspoke there. We have one layer of muscle, a muscularis, and then deep to the muscularis or towards the lumen, we're then going to have the mucosa. And I misread that here. I initially read that as muscularis. So we have one muscle layer, and then we have one mucosal layer. And that mucosal layer is then going to have an epithelium directly attached to that. It's worth emphasizing that there are no glands within the vagina. So as the vagina is being lubricated, this vagina is going to be lubricated by serous fluid. I'll switch to blue here. As we have increased blood flow to the vagina, we find that the vagina will be lubricated through vaginal sweating. So we have some water, some extracellular fluid ooze directly through the epithelium of the vagina. We also have cervical gland mucus, which is going to be draining directly into the vagina to also help lubricate the vagina. As we look at the vagina and the uterus and where they intersect, we have some indentations. Those indentations are referred to as fornices. So here we have one of the fornixes, and it's going to be a space that within the vagina that wraps around the cervix. So there's going to be some hollow space. If somebody is, in terms of, if we think of birth control, a lot of times the diaphragm for birth control purposes is going to be plugged. It's going to be hugging the fornices to cover the opening of the cervix. We also find that there are friction ridges, and these friction ridges are ridges within the vagina that increase friction. They're known as vaginal rugae, to use the technical term, and they are going to be a source of friction for the penis so that there can be manual or physical stimulation of the penis during thrusting or penile penetration, and they are also a source of pleasure for many women, although it depends on the individual woman. As we look at these mucosal folds within the vagina, a lot of times these mucosal folds are going to have an extra thick ridge, and that extra thick ridge within the vagina is referred to as the hymen. And usually that hymen is going to remain intact until a woman has vaginal intercourse for the first time. And during the first instance of vaginal intercourse, that hymen is torn, and there's going to be a little bit of bleeding. So I'll shift to red here. There'll be a little bit of blood loss during the tearing of that hymen. Many women report the very first time that they had penile penetration or penetration of their vagina by penis or large foreign object, that it was very painful while that hymen was being torn. As we look at the epithelium of the vagina, that epithelium that lines the vagina goes through something really cool. It transmorgifies. Well, that's not the technical term. The technical term is metaplasia. So it transforms from one epithelial tissue type to another epithelial tissue type. So when we look at prepubescent girls, they have a simple cuboidal epithelium lining their vaginal canal. But once that young girl hits puberty and becomes a young lady, she goes from having a simple cuboidal epithelium to a stratified squamous epithelium. And we need that stratified squamous epithelium. The stratification, or multiple layers of cells, is going to allow for the vagina or the vaginal canal to resist frictional forces. It's worth emphasizing that this is a stratified squamous epithelium that I pictured in this photomicrograph. It is non-keratinized. And because it's non-keratinized, we can have the transducate, or the liquid, go directly through the epithelial layer and help to lubricate the vagina. We also find that we have a lot of bacteria in the human vagina, and that bacteria is going to be constantly fermenting glycogen to produce acids, lactic acid being a common acid being produced, and then the overall pH of the vaginal environment is going to be quite acidic. And this acidic pH of the vagina is going to make it so that most potential pathogens are unable to grow within the woman's vagina. That's all we have for this recording. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to shoot them to me on the discussion boards. And as always, happy studies.